Hey guys, my name is Jamie Mathias and I'm a third grade teacher in Linden, Washington. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about essentialism and William Bennett. I'm going to share my screen, so hang tight 1 second. Alright, I want to start off by talking a little bit about essentialism and what it is in education. What essentialism looks like is essentialism in education argues that schools are academic institutions that should consist of fundamental skills. Essentialists emphasize that the classroom curriculum should provide a roadmap to teach basic skills and subjects. Teachers should teach to verifiable standards, and school is a place of order, discipline, and effective instruction. The ultimate goal of public education is to prepare people for productive, civil, and patriotic lives. The theory of essentialism is rooted in both realism and idealism. Its main purpose is to educate people that contribute to our society. The goal is that they will become productive members and contribute to the American economy and be both moral and valuable citizens. The curriculum is basic and it consists of reading, writing, math, history, English, science, language, etc., and art. It's cultural maintenance. Basically, that it really emphasizes the importance of tradition. The main proponents were Candle, Bagley, and Bestor. I want to start off by talking a little bit about the history of essentialism because I think it's important to talk about it before I introduce William Bennett. In the early 19th century, there was something called common schools, and these schools were created to teach students basic literacy skills and basic math. The goal was that they wanted to teach these students the skills they needed to go out into the world and contribute to society. They wanted the American economy to compete with economies around the world, and so it was really important that they produced workers. Something I thought was really interesting was the creation of the 3 R's. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. These were the foundational skills that were outlined and I guess promoted by William Bennett as well. Essentialism is rooted in patriotism and mental discipline, that American toughness that we've heard so much about in our history. One of the main people in the essentialism movement was William Bagley. We heard a little bit about him in our reading this week. He argued that progressivism was ruining the American school in the 1950s by relaxing standards, implementing play, and giving students way too much choice. So the metaphysics were the reality is the world is full of unchanging ideas. The epistemology is that knowing is observing and understanding. The axiology is that values are absolute and based on enduring ideas. And the educational implications are that the curriculum needs to focus on standards and skills. Okay. Historically, the role of the teacher was that in essentialism was that it's teacher-centered and lecture-based. I think this sounds a lot of like an old college lecture hall. This is what it sounds like to me. That lessons revolve around standards that cover the basics. They cover the skills. The professor or the teacher is extremely knowledgeable, and they're transferring knowledge of basic skills to just maintain the perpetuation of society. They teach in a logical sequence, and they're wise, they're looked up to, they're respected. The role of the student is to be compliant and orderly. They're expected to participate and give effort, and they are very disciplined. As history, as time went on in the 1950s, essentialism was either adopted in schools or it was completely rejected. And if it was rejected, it was likely because those schools were choosing to move towards the progressive movement. So Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, he declared that it was a nation at risk and that the American student was secondary to students all across the world. he wanted to improve the quality of basic public education, increase teacher expectations, pair education with the needs of the current economy, and he wanted to reduce violence by increasing behavior standards within the classroom. He also talked about something called the basic education revival, and this is where outside influencers other than educators came in and took a vested interest in public education. And these were like politicians, and they said, hey, we want to go back to the basics here. American students are floundering. They're secondary to many other countries, and we're giving these kids way too much choice. We're not teaching them the skills necessary to become valuable employees of the American workforce. This slogan was just one of the many slogans that showed criticism of the current public education back then. Many people believed that it was progressivism that was ruining the American public school. It was weakening the education system, and it was doing so by undermining traditional values. And they weren't holding students accountable to the high standards that they believed were previously set forth. So one of those politicians, I guess, during Ronald Reagan's presidency was the third Secretary of State, and that was William Bennett. William Bennett was a super influential, important, respected, well-known man in education. He had a voice, and he was willing to use it. He was sometimes controversial in his statements, but he was also what many people believed to be very smart and wise, and many people believed what he had to say. He grew up in Brooklyn, and he graduated from college with a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and then he earned a doctorate in philosophy. So he was a teacher, a politician. Like I said, he served as the third Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan. He was an author of 25 books, an advocate of the Common Core, and he was conservative. He really, really had a pride for America, and he wanted students to be disciplined and to value their country and become active participants in the workforce. His contributions to education. William Bennett believed in education. He was super patriotic, and he set the bar high. One of his quotes I really loved, it was, "Elementary school has no small place in a child's life. After all, indeed, except for the family, there is no institution so influential." This really made a connection to essentialism, because he says here that education is an institution. It's a foundation for children to learn the basic skills necessary for them to construct knowledge, build their knowledge over time, and become valuable members of society. He also wrote the James Madison Elementary School, a curriculum for American students. This was interesting because James Madison Elementary School was a fictitious school. It wasn't a real school. But it was an example of the curriculum that the American schools were to adopt. As the Secretary of Education, he published this so that it would be implemented in schools and that it would be adopted. And this was before the 2009 implementation of the Common Core. So this was an interesting contribution, because he was saying, hey, this is what I want all kids in America to know and be able to do. Here's an example of it. I took a picture of it. If you want to pause your screen and take a look, it's quite generic and broad, but I thought it was really interesting. He was also a very distinguished author. In 1993, Bennett published his most popular book, which was called The Book of Virtues. On the inside of the book, a quote read, "Responsibility, courage, compassion, honesty, friendship, persistence, faith. Everyone recognizes these traits as essentials of good character." In order for our children to develop such traits, we have to offer them examples of good and bad, right and wrong, and the best places to find them are in great works of literature and exemplary stories from history. One thing that was really important to Bennett was books from history. He found that the great books, integrating them into education was essential. He also wrote The Educated Child and Is College Worth It? In 2013, he endorsed the Common Core, but he did add that he does believe that reading the books, the great books that shaped our country and formed our culture, paired with standards and assessment, are essential. He said, "Don't you believe all students should have some familiarity with the Bible, Shakespeare, and the great books of Western culture?" He asked this question with all sincerity. So this leaves me with my discussion questions for you guys. I think that William Bennett had a huge impact on essentialism of the modern day. Obviously, he wasn't the original founders of essentialism, but he really brought it forth to the American public school in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And as a child, I remember my classroom being that of essentialism. I remember having lecture-based teaching, and I remember not having very many hands-on activities. I was there to learn, and I was not to interrupt or disagree or discuss. That was the experience that I had, and I think that William Bennett brought that into the forefront in our modern day schools. So my question for you is, how much of your educational experience was derived from essentialism? Do you agree or disagree with the core ideas of essentialism, and do they support learning? Why or why not? Do you believe teaching specific content like math, language arts, social studies, science, art, and language in American schools is essential? And what I mean by that is all of them. Why or why not? Thank you so much for hanging out with me for the last little bit, and I hope we had fun talking about William Bennett. Have a good one.